Seen through the eyes of a military family counselor, this is a heartbreaking story about silence, misunderstanding, and the damage done when service cannot be explained. Elise doesn't lose her family in one dramatic moment. She loses them slowly, holiday by holiday, joke by joke, while carrying a burden none of them can see. And when the truth finally surfaces, it doesn't heal quietly, it detonates.
I am Elise Morrow, a 31-year-old lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy, serving in an intelligence agency so secret its existence is denied. For 13 years, my own family believed I was a failure who washed out of basic training. I sacrificed holidays, birthdays, and even my father's final moments to maintain the false identity the Navy built for me. But everything changed at my dad's memorial when a SEAL Admiral blocked my path to the front row, saying it was for military only, and my mother watched in silence. That was the moment I chose to reclaim my life. Have you ever been completely misjudged by the people who should know you best? Share your experience in the comments below. Before I reveal what happened next, I would love to know where everyone is watching from today. And if you have ever had to fight for your own truth against your family's assumptions, please tap the like button and subscribe for more stories about quiet resilience. The next part of this story might come as a shock. I grew up in Virginia Beach, a few streets from the Atlantic, in a house that always smelled of sea spray and my dad's boot polish. He was Master Chief Oliver Morrow, a Navy SEAL with a 30-year career who was gone more often than he was home. I learned young that a service family runs on hope, not calendars. It is the hope that you will hear footsteps at the door again, and the faith that the muddy boots by the entrance will have their owner return to them, safe and sound. My mother, Sandra, was the rock that kept our family steady. She juggled school pickups, household bills, grocery shopping on base, and maintaining the family van because my dad was always deployed. She could host a barbecue with a smile so genuine, no one would guess she'd been awake for 72 hours straight, sick with worry about her husband. She went to every school conference alone. She taught herself to unclog a drain, patch a hole in the wall, and navigate the complex tax forms for a deployed service member. She possessed a quiet strength that often went unnoticed. I think carrying that weight alone for so long is what hardened her. When you are forced to be strong for decades, that strength becomes a permanent part of who you are. My brother, Tyler, was 4 years older than me. He was the high school football hero, a member of the homecoming court, and a favorite among his teachers. People were naturally drawn to his outgoing personality. He earned a scholarship to Virginia Tech for construction management and later moved to Richmond. Tyler was considered the family's success story, mainly because his life was so easy to understand. His career was straightforward. He was always present for family gatherings, and he called home every Sunday. He was the son my mother could proudly talk about, the evidence of her success as a parent. And then there was me, the quiet observer. I was always watching from the sidelines, absorbing everything around me. I read books that were years ahead of my grade level and asked questions that often made adults shift in their seats. When my dad came home from a deployment, Tyler would greet him with a flying leap into his arms, followed by a game of catch in the yard. I did things differently. I would just sit on the front steps, waiting for his car to pull up. As he walked toward me, I would study his face. He would kneel down, place his hands on my shoulders, and ask, "Elise, what are you thinking about?" I would then ask him about the world he had seen, what the ocean looked like in total darkness, or if he ever got scared. He never gave me a straight answer, but the look he gave me confirmed that the questions were what he valued most. My father rarely showed his emotions. 3 decades as a SEAL tends to build walls around a man. But in those quiet moments on our walkway, when his daughter asked him the things no one else dared to, I saw it clearly. It was a deep, unspoken pride, the kind of pride that exists in the silence between words. I wanted to be just like him, but not the version my brother looked up to. Not the dad who cooked burgers on the grill, played football, and swapped war stories with other SEALs at neighborhood cookouts. I wanted to be the man who vanished for months at a time and came back changed. the one who held secrets he could never share, the one whose body woke him at 4 in the morning out of pure habit because rest had become a foreign concept. At 17 years old, I did not fully comprehend the weight of such a life. I just knew it was the most authentic part of him, and I wanted it for myself. The summer after my high school graduation, I told him my plan. We were in the garage, his personal refuge, where a truck engine was disassembled across the floor. His arms were stained with grease. I sat on a spare bucket and said, "Dad, I am going to join the Navy." He did not look up right away. He finished tightening a bolt, set down his tool, and cleaned his hands on an old rag. Then his eyes met mine, and he said, "The Navy will take everything you are willing to offer it. Just be sure you understand that," he added. I told him I did. He gave a single, firm nod. There was no smile, no argument, no attempt to change my mind. He just picked his wrench back up and returned to the engine. That was his version of a blessing. My mother, on the other hand, wept for 2 days. She had hoped I would go to college and live what she called a regular life. Tyler thought I was just looking for attention. "You are not Dad," he scoffed one evening at the dinner table. "You are not going to be a SEAL." I refused to engage with him. I signed my enlistment papers a week after graduation, and in August of 2013, I was at Recruit Training Command. I was 18 years old, weighed 132 pounds, and had never been more confident about a choice in my life. Boot camp was brutal in all the expected ways, and in some that caught you by surprise. Sleep was a luxury, the shouting was constant, and the physical demands were so intense that recruits much larger than me were broken by week 1. But I absolutely thrived. The structure, the discipline, and the clear sense of purpose felt like home. I ranked first in my division for running and swimming, and second in push-ups, just behind a woman from Oklahoma who had a good 40 pounds on me. I was also in the top 3 academically. During the second week, my commander, Chief Petty Officer Brennan, took me aside. He said he saw a rare quality in me. He never specified what that quality was. His only advice was, stay focused and keep performing. 3 weeks later, at 4 in the morning, 2 men in plain clothes woke me up. They had no uniforms, no name badges, just a file with my name on the cover. They told me I was selected for a new assignment and had to go with them immediately. There were no details, and it was not a request. My drill instructor was told I had a medical discharge. My peers were told I had failed. My official record reads, administrative separation for failure to adapt. My family was told, quite simply, that I quit. They led me to a phone in a sterile hallway under buzzing fluorescent lights. One of the men stood about 6 feet away, watching me with his arms folded. I dialed my parents' number. My mother answered almost instantly. I told her I was coming home. I counted the 3 seconds of silence that followed before she spoke. Your father is going to be incredibly disappointed. I desperately wanted to tell her the real story, that I had not failed but had been chosen, that my test scores were in the top 1% in the country, and that the Office of Naval Intelligence had pulled me for a highly classified program. I wanted to scream that this was a bigger deal than boot camp, bigger than the SEALs, bigger than she could ever comprehend. But as I opened my mouth, the man leaning against the wall gave a slow, deliberate shake of his head. That was all it took. "I know, Mom. I am sorry," was all I said before hanging up. That brief conversation cost me my family for 13 years. The lie that I had washed out of the Navy became an unshakable truth. It was the foundation of every single thing they said about me. At Thanksgiving, my mother would sigh and say, "Elise could not even make it through basic." When neighbors asked about me, she would explain that the military just was not for her. And Tyler? He turned my failure into his favorite joke. "My sister quit the Navy after 3 weeks," he would say with a smirk that was meant to look like pity but was pure satisfaction. 3 weeks. That is all she could handle. For years, that story became my identity. It was not just something that happened. It was who I was. I was the Morrow child who failed, while my brother, Tyler, was the success. That was the official family story, and I was forbidden from correcting it. But behind that lie, I was becoming someone else entirely. The intelligence program I entered was incredibly demanding. After leaving boot camp, I attended 14 weeks of training at a classified facility, learning skills I can never discuss. I officially became an intelligence specialist in my first year. Languages came easily to me. I picked up Arabic in 6 months and Farsi in 8. In 2015, I achieved the rank of Petty Officer Second Class and was accepted into the Seaman to Admiral program. It was a special Navy track designed to turn exceptional enlisted sailors into officers. I completed a 4-year degree in only 2 years at a university affiliated with the Navy, all while maintaining my intelligence work. By 2017, I earned my commission as an ensign. I was a 22-year-old naval officer, yet my family thought I had a boring government desk job. For 2 years, I served on the USS Halsey, a guided missile destroyer operating out of San Diego, with deployments to the Western Pacific and the Arabian Gulf. I led the ship's intelligence team, providing our commanding officer with daily briefings on threats that guided our missions. After 18 months of service, I was promoted to lieutenant junior grade. Then, in 2019, my career path shifted dramatically. I was assigned to the Joint Special Operations Command in North Carolina. At this new post, all of my specialized training converged. I began supporting elite units like the SEAL teams my own father had once served in. My intelligence work directly informed high-stakes operations. From inside command centers, I watched raids and rescues unfold on live feeds, witnessing events I am bound to secrecy to never speak of. I made lieutenant in 2020. My work took me to places I cannot name for missions I will never describe. I witnessed things on screens at 3 a.m. that are forever etched in my memory. But every Thanksgiving I made it home. My mother introduced me the same way. This is my daughter who tried the Navy, but it was not for her. I never corrected her. I simply could not. Protecting my cover story was paramount, even if it turned me into a family joke. It did not bother me when my brother called me a failure. The information I handled was classified at the highest level. Telling the truth, even to them, could endanger lives. It could compromise critical missions. So, I sat at that holiday table year after year, quietly taking the criticism, but a single conversation gave me the fortitude to endure it all. It happened on Thanksgiving in 2019. I had just 2 days at home between deployments. The house was full of relatives. My brother Tyler was there with his family. The dining room was filled with aunts and uncles. My mother was in the kitchen, boasting about Tyler's latest construction contract. She barely glanced up as I came in, saying, "Oh, Elise is here. Good." Later that night, I escaped to the garage for some quiet. In the dark, I leaned against my father's workbench, the exact spot where I had told him I was enlisting 6 years earlier. His old engine parts were gone, replaced by neatly organized tools and a radio that only played country music. I could hear the sounds of laughter from inside. The garage door creaked open, and my father stepped inside. He left the light off, simply leaning against the opposite wall with his arms folded. After a minute of silence, he spoke in a low voice. I was in the teams long enough to know what a medical separation looks like, and that is not you. Tears immediately filled my eyes. I was unable to speak. I could not confirm or deny anything. I just stood there in the darkness, struggling to keep my breathing steady. He gave a single, slow nod, which was all the confirmation I ever needed. He pushed himself off the wall to go, but stopped at the door. Without turning around, he said, "I am proud of you, kid, for whatever it is that you are doing." Then he returned to the house. He never brought it up again. He never corrected my mother at the dinner table. He never told Tyler to stop his jokes. He respected my clearance more than my reputation, because he knew some things were bigger than being understood. That was our final conversation about my job. He took my secret with him when he passed away. Tyler's resentment only deepened through 2020 and 2021. His marriage fell apart. His wife left, took their daughter, and moved to Northern Virginia. Tyler was left with child support payments, a nearly empty apartment, and a business that was going under. He began to drink more and always arrived at family events looking for a fight. All of that anger was directed at me. In his mind, I was a symbol of his own failures. I had a vague government job, a plain car, and a modest apartment. I arrived for holidays with no husband, no kids, and no apparent ambition. When I was not there, he called me the family freeloader. He said it to our mother and our cousins, telling anyone who would listen. My mother never challenged him. From her perspective, he was just speaking the truth. I will always remember Thanksgiving dinner in 2021. I had come straight from spending 72 consecutive hours in a command center. We were coordinating a hostage rescue in West Africa. My team worked without a break to find 3 captured Americans. We located them, the operators went in, and all 3 hostages came home safe. I drove from the base to my mother's, changing clothes in my car and bringing a store-bought pie. Tyler was already at the table. He looked from me to the pie and sneered. "Must be nice to get a government paycheck for doing nothing." My mother chuckled. It was not a malicious laugh, but the kind that comes from believing a story for so long you can no longer see its cruelty. I sat down and ate, forcing a smile when necessary before leaving at 9. I drove home in the dark, the sound of my mother's laughter echoing in my head. When I got back, I just sat in my car in the driveway. The lights were on in my apartment, but I felt like an outsider looking in, just as I did at my mother's house. I was a stranger in my own life. I had spent the week saving 3 people, yet the only thing that stood out from my holiday was my brother's insult and my mother's agreement. That night, I started to wonder if the cover story was worth the price I was paying. In 2021, I was selected for a classified intelligence group reporting directly to the Director of National Intelligence. This was the highest level of secrecy. I was promoted to lieutenant commander and put in charge of a targeting cell for Tier 1 operations. It was the most vital work of my career, alongside the best people in the intelligence community. The security was so extreme, my previous commander was not even aware of my transfer until the official orders arrived. I was only 26 years old. I held one of the highest security clearances in the Department of Defense. And my family truly believed my job was to answer phones. In 2023, my father started to decline. At 57, he was still on active duty but approaching his 30-year mandatory retirement from the teams. He had been making plans for months, including a fishing trip with his old SEAL buddies, but he lacked the energy. Sandra was the first to see it. He was sleeping more and eating less. In October, Navy doctors performed tests. The results came in November and were devastating. It was stage 4 pancreatic cancer, too advanced for any meaningful treatment. The doctor gave him maybe 6 to 12 months to live. My father listened calmly in the exam room, then looked at the doctor and said, "That is more time than some of the men I served with ever received." Sandra broke down completely. Tyler drove down from Richmond and stayed for a week. The moment I got the news, I submitted a request for emergency leave. It was denied. I was in the middle of a critical ongoing mission. Active targeting operations were underway, and lives were in jeopardy. My director apologized but explained that the mission could not be paused. I missed the appointment when he received the diagnosis. I missed his first 2 rounds of treatment. I missed 3 family gatherings. Eventually, Sandra stopped calling me with any updates. A single text arrived from my brother, Tyler. It said, "Thanks for another no-show." For a full 10 minutes, I just looked at the screen. Then I placed the phone face down and returned to my duties. What hurt the most was that he had a point. I had not been present. It was not a choice I wanted to make. I would have given anything to be by his side. But my work involves saving people who will never learn my identity. The price for my absence, even for 1 week, is counted in lives lost. My dad would have recognized that math. He did it himself for 30 years. My siblings, Tyler and Sandra, could not possibly understand, and I was forbidden from telling them. So I absorbed their resentment, the same way I handled everything else, quietly and by myself. My father died on January 14th, 2025, inside Naval Medical Center, Portsmouth. My dad was only 58. For 30 years and 4 months, he had dedicated his life to the United States Navy. He was awarded a Bronze Star for valor, 2 Purple Hearts, and he held the complete trust of every man he served with. I arrived 6 hours too late, on a flight from an undisclosed location. I am not permitted to say where I came from or what my job was there. As soon as the plane was on the ground at Norfolk International, I powered on my phone. 17 missed calls lit up the screen. I did not check the messages. I already knew the news. I went straight to the hospital. Its hallways had that familiar smell of disinfectant and stale coffee. I saw my mother standing alone, right outside his door. The expression she wore was completely new to me. Her look was not exactly anger. It was something past that point. It was a look of pure, final exhaustion. She did not speak a word. She just pivoted, went back into my father's room, and quietly closed the door. I stood alone in that corridor for 11 minutes. To pass the time, I looked up and counted 47 tiles on the ceiling. One of the nurses walked past me twice. A hospital chaplain offered to sit with me. I politely declined. Finally, the door opened, and my brother Tyler came out. He stared directly at me and simply said, "You missed it." He then walked right by me toward the elevators. I entered the room. My father looked calm, a little smaller and more frail than I remembered, but he was at peace. His hands were folded on his chest. Someone had placed his sealed trident pin on the bedside table. I sat down in the chair beside him and stayed for 2 hours straight. I could not cry. I held his hand and told him everything I should have told him years ago. I let him know that I was still in the service. I told him about my command, the intelligence cell, and the directorate. I spoke about the operations I helped plan and the lives I helped save. I revealed all the secrets that security rules had forced me to keep. Then, I said I was sorry, not for my career, but for all the missed holidays, the unanswered phone calls, and every time the mission came first. Even though he was gone, I had a feeling he understood. His memorial service was scheduled for July, a full 6 months later. The service was planned for the chapel at Naval Station Norfolk, complete with full military honors. My father had earned every single part of that tribute. He spent 30 years as a Navy SEAL, completed countless combat deployments, and had enough medals to cover a full page. He left a legacy that inspired younger SEALs to straighten their posture at the mere mention of his name. That chapel would be packed. It would be full of SEALs in their dress whites and officers from all across special operations. Our family and friends would occupy the pews right behind them. I made the drive to the base alone that Saturday morning. The Virginia sky was a heavy, uniform gray, weighing down on the world like a blanket. I was wearing a simple black dress. I had no jewelry on, just my father's watch that I took from his hospital room. I chose not to wear my uniform, so I displayed no rank or insignia. That was a conscious choice. This day was for my dad. I was not attending as Lieutenant Commander Morrow. I was attending as Oliver's daughter. When I arrived, the chapel was almost at capacity. I could see Sandra and Tyler in the first pew, surrounded by relatives I had not seen in years. My Uncle Ray and Aunt Patricia were also there. Tyler's ex-wife was not, but their little girl, Lily, sat in Sandra's lap. Behind our family, the pews were filled with a sea of dress whites and gold braid. I recognized some of the faces SEALs I had provided intel for, commanders I had given briefings to, and operators who ran missions based on my team's targeting information. Not a single person knew me. In their eyes, I was simply an unknown woman in a black dress. At the front, Rear Admiral James McEwen, a Navy 2-star, stood at the podium. He had been my father Oliver's commanding officer for the last 10 years of his career. It was McEwen who awarded my dad his final promotion, greenlit his last deployment, and visited him 3 times in the hospital. The Admiral was the definition of a Navy officer, tall, commanding, and with an air of authority that filled any space. He was leading the memorial. I began walking up the center aisle. The sound of my heels echoed loudly in the silent room. Sandra saw me right away. Her body stiffened and her face grew cold. She walked directly to McEwen, who was speaking with guests at the front. I watched her talk to him, but could not make out the words from that distance. I was maybe 20 feet away, but I found out what she told him later on. She said, "That is my daughter. She is not in the service. She tried to get in but washed out of boot camp." The Admiral gave a quick, curt nod. It was the kind of gesture an officer makes after receiving information and forming an immediate conclusion. He left my mother and started walking toward me to cut me off. He stood at least 6'2", carrying himself with a natural command. He put his hand on my upper arm. It was not a gentle touch, but a controlling one, used to escort someone from a secure area. His grasp was so tight I felt each individual finger press into my arm. He stared down at me from his great height. I am 5'6", which meant he had a good 8 inches on me. His voice was loud enough for the first 3 pews to hear clearly. He said, "Please move. This area is for military personnel only." The chapel did not go quiet all at once. The silence rolled through the room like a wave. The front row heard him and stopped talking. The second row noticed the quiet and looked to see the cause. In a matter of seconds, the silence reached the rear doors, and every eye was on us. The entire congregation saw an admiral with his hand on a woman's arm, escorting her from the front of the chapel during her own father's memorial. My brother Tyler just looked at the floor. My mother sat perfectly still, her back rigid and her hands in her lap, saying nothing. She remained completely silent. She did not say, "Wait a minute," or "She is my daughter," or "There has been a mistake." Not one word. She was the one who had lied to the Admiral. She started this entire incident, and now she was watching it happen. I did not resist. I did not cause a disturbance. I never said, "I am a lieutenant commander in the Navy, and my rank is higher than most of the people in this room." I just turned around and walked toward the back. My heels made that same clicking sound on the floor. 200 sets of eyes followed my every step. The SEALs, the officers, the enlisted men, and my own family all observed as I was removed from the front of my father's service. I kept my gaze fixed forward. I controlled my breathing, keeping it slow and steady. I did what I've been trained to do for 13 years. I tolerated the injustice. Just then, McEwen's phone vibrated. He pulled it from an inside pocket of his dress uniform to check the display. I had taken about 5 more steps toward the back of the chapel. He answered the phone. While I could not hear the conversation, I could see its effect on his face. I had turned my head slightly for a last look, and I witnessed the transformation. All the color vanished from his face. Not slowly, but all at once, like a switch being flipped. His posture shifted completely. His shoulders, so confident just 3 seconds earlier, now seemed to shrink before tightening with stress. His free hand, the one he had used to grab me, dropped limply to his side. He said only 2 words into the phone. "Yes, sir." After a brief silence, he added, "Understood, sir." Then he ended the call. The caller was Captain William Driscoll, who was in charge of Naval Station Norfolk. The captain had been monitoring the chapel's security feed from his office, a standard practice during high-profile events. He saw the entire exchange with McEwen grabbing my arm. He saw my mother point me out, and he knew exactly who I was. My intelligence directorate had given a security brief to his entire command just 6 months earlier. Captain Driscoll probably kept his words brief. He told the Admiral who he had just manhandled, and then he gave him a direct order to fix his mistake. By then I was halfway down the aisle, my pace steady, my expression neutral. The entire chapel was silent. It felt like 200 people had stopped breathing, Lieutenant Commander Morrow. I froze. My hand came to rest on the smooth back of a wooden pew. I believe it was in the 8th row. I did not immediately look back. I stayed motionless for 2 full seconds, my palm flat on the pew, allowing the silence to hang in the air. Then I slowly turned. Every single person was looking right at me. 200 people, my father's friends, his leaders, his men, and his own family were all focused on the woman who was just told she was not welcome. Admiral McEwen walked toward me. His steps echoed, just as sharp and deliberate as before, but noticeably slower. The Admiral faced me, and his body went rigid. He adopted a perfect military stance. His shoulders were back, his chin was up, and his arms were pinned to his sides as he stared directly into my eyes. Then his hand came up in a salute. His voice trembled slightly when he addressed me. "Ma'am, I did not realize. That front seat is yours." I brought my own hand up to return the gesture. I held it for a flawless count, the way they drill into you, the way my own father would have expected. After lowering my arm, I remained silent. Speaking would have ruined the intensity of the moment. I turned and started toward the front pew. As I walked, every officer in uniform began to stand. It started in the row just behind the first, with a commander I did not recognize, a man who rose from his chair wearing the silver oak leaves of his rank. The next row of officers stood, and then the one behind them. This continued row by row. Before I even reached the front of the church, every person in uniform was on their feet. The motion spread from the center of the chapel outward, like a wave from a stone dropped in a calm pond, reaching every edge. My mother's mouth was agape. She had stopped folding her hands and was now clutching the pew in front of her for support. My brother Tyler stared straight at me. He was not looking down at the floor or his shoes, but directly at me. It was like he was seeing who I really was for the first time. The woman walking down the aisle looked like his sister, but was someone he did not know at all. I took my seat. Sandra was only 2 chairs down from me. A heavy quiet settled in the space between us. While everyone in the chapel stood, a peculiar feeling washed over me. After 13 years, I no longer had to justify myself. The memorial service resumed. Admiral McEwen returned to the podium to talk about my father, Oliver. He spoke of 30 years of service, mentioning his leadership of the teams, the men he shaped, and the missions he led. His voice was steady and formal, but his hands shook where they rested on the lectern. He did not mention my name again during his tribute. He did not need to. Everyone in that room understood what had just happened. People offered handshakes and solemn nods. I heard quiet whispers of "Ma'am," and "I am sorry for your loss, Commander." A senior chief petty officer then approached me. He was a broad, tough-looking man, his uniform covered with a seal trident and more service ribbons than I could count. "Your father mentioned you," he told me. He never gave details, but he was always proud. I gave a small nod and said thank you, holding myself together until he walked away. From across the room, Sandra stared. For the past 20 minutes, she had been standing motionless by the chapel entrance with Tyler and my Aunt Patricia. Her expression was one of complete disbelief, as if her reality had been shattered. Tyler tried to walk over to me twice, but he stopped after just 3 paces and returned to his mother's side each time. I did not go to the reception. It was held at Sandra's house, with catered food, chairs arranged on the grass, and a photo presentation of Dad's life on a computer. I could not bring myself to be there. It was not anger holding me back, not exactly. The emotion was deeper, something I could not name. I drove back to my apartment in Norfolk, parked in the underground garage, and took the elevator up to the 3rd floor. Once inside, I sat down on my living room floor. I stayed there for 2 hours in the dark. I turned on no lights, ate nothing, and shed no tears. I just sat with my back to the sofa, staring into the blackness, feeling the weight of 13 years press down on me. I kept replaying the events of the day in my head. McEwen placing his hand on my arm, my mother's stunned silence, and the expression on Tyler's face. The phone call, the crisp salute, and the sight of the whole chapel rising. My thoughts turned to my father, who kept the secret silently because his work was more important than his own reputation. I felt no anger and no relief. There was only an emptiness I had not experienced since he died. It was like a support beam I had leaned on for 13 years had just given way. 3 days later, I called Captain Grace Tanaka. She was the senior intelligence officer who recognized my abilities and recruited me out of basic training years ago. I recalled seeing her in a hallway while I made a call to my mother from a payphone. She had subtly shaken her head when I came close to telling the truth. After that, she became my mentor in the military. Grace recommended me for JSOC and pushed for my assignment to the Intelligence Directorate. She was essentially the person who built my career. Grace was also the only mother figure in my life who understood what I did. I told her everything that happened at the memorial. I detailed McEwen's actions, the phone call, the salute, Sandra's expression, and Tyler's shock. She listened to the entire story without interruption. When I was done, there was a long pause, maybe 10 or 15 seconds of complete quiet. "You did nothing wrong, Elise," she said at last. "That cover story was vital. It protected operations and saved people's lives. Not just in this country, but in places your family does not know exist, for people they will never meet. Your father understood that. It was everything to him." Then I asked something that I had not intended to. "Did my father ever get in touch with you?" I had to hear it from someone outside my family. Grace paused for a second before she replied. "Once. Around 4 years ago, he managed to find the general line for my office, which was not simple since I never gave him the number. He said, 'This message is for Captain Tanaka. I am not aware of what my daughter does, but I know it is important. I believed someone in her chain of command should know that her father is proud of her.' That was all he said. He hung up before I could even respond. When the call with Grace was over, I did not move. I remained on my bed with the phone in my lap, absorbing the impact of what she had told me. My father had contacted her. He had made the significant effort to track her down, just to let her know he was proud. He had not asked questions or tried to learn any secrets. He just wanted someone in my command to know that he recognized the value of my work. For all those years, I had wondered if he was ashamed of me. I had thought he might secretly agree with the things Sandra said at the dinner table. I had always mistaken his silence for disappointment. But it was never that. It was pride. He had been proud the entire time. He just could not say it to the people who needed to hear it most. It was not that he did not want to, but he knew that some secrets have to be protected. He understood that the weight of keeping those secrets falls heaviest on the people you love. Meanwhile, things at Sandra's house were becoming tense. Tyler was pacing the living room, completely rattled by what had happened at the funeral. His nervous energy was obvious. He could not stand still, and his voice was unsteady. He kept replaying the Admiral's touch on my arm, the call, and my words. "Yes, sir." He imagined the salute and the 200 officers standing for the same woman his own mother had called a disappointment. Sandra was sitting at the kitchen table, where she had been since she got back from the service. The untouched catered food was behind her on the kitchen counter. From the next room, the slideshow of Oliver's life played on, cycling through images of him in uniform, on deployment, and with his soldiers. She could hear the quiet clicks as the pictures changed, but she was staring at nothing. Tyler stopped in the kitchen doorway. "How?" was all he said. "How does someone who supposedly failed basic training get a salute from a 2-star admiral? I need you to explain it." Sandra did not look up. Her hands were flat on the table, fingers spread wide as if trying to find some truth in the wood grain. "I do not know," she replied. Tyler kept pushing. "So she lied to us for 13 years? Finally, Sandra lifted her face. Her eyes were puffy but dry. She had passed the point of tears and was now in a state of cold clarity. She spoke quietly. "Or maybe we were the ones who were wrong for 13 years. I heard nothing from them after that, which did not surprise me. The memorial had destroyed the story our family had believed for over a decade. They were just starting to sort through the pieces. I understood. I had 13 years to get used to the truth. They had only had 90 minutes. In the following 2 days, Sandra called me 3 separate times. I saw my phone light up but did not answer. It was not out of anger. I just did not have the energy to explain a classified 13-year career on a call, especially to her, in the very kitchen where she had called me a failure. I sent back a single text. I am okay. I just need some time. Tyler told me later that she stared at that message for a whole hour. Then my brother did something unexpected. 5 days after the service, he drove to Naval Station Norfolk. He parked in the guest lot, walked into the public affairs office, and told the sailor on duty that he was Elise Morrow's brother and wanted to learn about her job in the Navy. The petty officer was a young woman, perhaps 23, who eyed him for a moment before picking up a phone. Tyler simply waited. He told me he stood at that counter for nearly 10 minutes, feeling increasingly foolish as the woman murmured into the handset. Without warning, a nearby door opened, and 2 men in civilian clothes walked out. They were polite and professional, showing him credentials from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. Calmly and directly, they explained that details about personnel in classified positions could not be released and that his visit was now officially noted. Then, they escorted him from the naval base. From the parking lot, Tyler called Sandra, his voice shaking. "Mom, they escorted me right off the base. 2 agents from NCIS. All because I asked about my own sister." Sandra was silent for a moment. Tyler pressed on. "What kind of trouble is she in? What is she actually doing?" Sandra answered, "I don't know, but it's clearly much more serious than we ever thought." Tyler didn't realize it then, but his visit to the base revealed more than any conversation could have. Federal agents do not remove someone from a secure base just for asking about a clerk. That kind of response happens only when the person you ask about is doing work so secret that their job title itself is classified. The following week, I met with Grace Tanaka. Her office was a windowless room on the 3rd floor of a building that does not appear on any public map. I told her I was done living the lie. Not the official cover story, of course. I would never compromise an operation or endanger my team. But I was finished allowing my family's false image of me to be the only one. I was done sitting through holiday meals, absorbing their jokes about how I failed. I refused to be the family punchline any longer. Grace understood completely. She had seen it happen before, with intelligence officers whose cover stories began to take over their real identities. She confirmed the Navy would not declassify my work. The specifics of my job, the directorate, the targeting cell, and my operations would all remain secret. But there were certain things I was finally allowed to share. My actual rank, my officer's commission, my unbroken years of service, and the truth that I was a naval officer. I joined the Navy at 18, and I never really got out. The details had to stay classified. But the larger truth, the one my family had misunderstood for 13 years, was finally something I could tell. I decided I would tell them, but it had to be on my terms and my timeline. It would not be because the memorial service forced my hand, or because Sandra and Tyler were demanding answers. It would be because I had earned the right to be seen for the person I truly was. That night, I opened my closet. My dress white uniform hung in the back, perfectly pressed and clean, still in the dry cleaner's plastic from a classified briefing 7 months prior. It had 2.5 gold stripes on the sleeves, the mark of a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy. My family had never once laid eyes on me in this uniform, not in 13 years. I ran my fingers along the sleeve, feeling the weight of what those stripes represented. All of the training, the deployments, the missions, and the personal cost. It was every phone call I missed, every holiday I could not attend, and every family dinner I sat through in total silence. I left the uniform in its bag, but kept the closet door ajar. 3 weeks after the memorial, I could feel a shift, even from a distance. Sandra was beginning to unravel, not in a loud, dramatic fashion, but in the quiet way people do when a long-held belief system shatters. She started replaying years of her own comments. Every Thanksgiving she declared that I just couldn't make it. Every conversation with a neighbor when she wrote me off with, well, at least she gave the military a try. It just wasn't for her. It was every time she proudly displayed Tyler's latest construction project, then glanced at me with a look of both pity and disappointment. She pulled out old photo albums from a closet in the guest room. She spread them across the dining room table, examining them one by one. Thanksgiving 2014, Christmas 2016, the 4th of July 2018. And she finally noticed what had been there all along, my quiet composure. The careful way I answered questions about work, specific enough to sound normal but vague enough to reveal nothing. How I would redirect inquiries instead of denying them. It was the disciplined poise of someone trained to keep secrets in a room full of prying questions. That self-control had been present the whole time, in every photograph, at every holiday meal, and in every single conversation. She had just never taken the time to notice it. She dialed her friend Deborah, a Navy wife of 40 years, whose husband retired as a captain. Deborah had seen a great deal in her life as a military spouse. She understood the world that Sandra was only now discovering. Sandra told her everything. The memorial service, McKeevan's, the phone call, the salute, and the officers standing at attention. Deborah listened without interruption. Then she said, "Sandra, people in those programs are forbidden to tell you anything. That is the whole point. The cover story isn't a lie. It is protection," Sandra replied. "But for 13 years, Deborah cut her off. She was not lying to you. She was protecting you. There is a world of difference, and the fact that you can't see it right now doesn't change the truth." Sandra ended the call and sat at her kitchen table, her hands folded. A new realization was beginning to dawn, one that would require months for her to fully process. Her daughter had not washed out of the Navy. She had gone deeper into it than Sandra could ever have imagined. And the silence, all those years of quiet holidays, was not a mark of failure. It was a mark of discipline. Tyler was changing too. His encounter with NCIS had deeply unsettled him. For years he had mocked me, so convinced he was right, and now that entire foundation was gone. He sat in his truck one evening outside his apartment in Richmond, engine off and windows closed. He thought about every time he had called me a freeloader, every holiday joke he made, and every eye roll when I explained I could not talk about my job. He pulled out his phone and typed 2 simple words, "I am sorry." He stared at the text for 5 long minutes before he finally pressed send. I was at my desk when the message came through. I read it, leaned back in my chair, and typed 2 words back. "I know." Tyler looked at my reply for a very long time. Just those 2 words. No exclamation mark, no emoji, nothing like, "It's fine" or "Don't worry." Simply, "I know." I think he was hoping for forgiveness. What he got instead was an acknowledgement. And I suspect he eventually understood that the acknowledgement was a much more honest response than forgiveness would have been. Word started to get around the Navy community in Virginia Beach. Military bases are like small towns, and the SEAL community is even smaller. Oliver Merrow's former teammates, the men he served with, trained with, and who hoisted him on their shoulders at his retirement, began to call Sandra. They did not phone to scold or embarrass her, but to offer her some context. A retired senior chief named Pete Garza visited her house one afternoon. Pete was 61, built like a fire hydrant, with a handshake that could probably turn coal into diamond. He had served with my father for 15 years, including 3 deployments, 2 of which forged a bond that lasts a lifetime. Sandra welcomed him in. She made some coffee. Pete sat down at the kitchen table, the same one where Sandra had been struggling for weeks to make sense of her own daughter. He then shared something with her that she never knew. He said, Oliver rang me about 4 years back, late at night. He had been drinking, not a lot, but enough to loosen his tongue. He told me, "Pete, my little girl is doing things I can never know about, and I have never been more proud." I asked him what he was talking about. He just said, "I can't say. I just needed to tell someone who would understand." And that was the end of the call. In that instant, Sandra completely broke down. She began to sob in a way I doubt she had since the day my father died. It was a deep, painful cry that came from a place far below the surface, from the part of a person that holds the greatest regrets. She had just learned from a man who knew her husband for 15 years that Oliver had been aware of the truth the entire time. He knew I had not failed. He knew I was part of something important, and he kept it from her, not because he lacked trust in her, but because his commitment to the work was absolute. That evening, Sandra sat alone, clutching Oliver's trident pin. She turned it over in her fingers, feeling the shapes of the eagle, the trident, the anchor, and the pistol. It was the emblem that defined her husband, and she finally understood that her husband and her daughter belonged to a world she could never be a part of. A text message from Sandra arrived on a Saturday morning in late August. It was simple and direct. "The Lighthouse Diner, Saturday. Just you and me, please." That diner was a little spot on Shore Drive my father used to take Tyler and me to after Sunday service when we were kids. I remembered the sticky vinyl booths, the plastic-coated menus, and a waitress named June. She called everybody Han and refilled your coffee before you even had to ask. It had been years since I last set foot in that place. I stared at her message for a full day before responding. I had no clue what this meeting was about. Would it be an ambush, a truce, a battle, or a scolding? On Sunday morning, I simply typed OK and hit send, not giving myself a chance to back out. When Saturday came, I drove over. I parked in the gravel lot out back and sat in my car for 3 long minutes, just looking at the diner's entrance. I rehearsed about a dozen different scenarios in my head. In a few, I was calm and detached. In others, I finally unleashed 13 years of unspoken words, the kind of sharp truths that feel amazing to say, but terrible to hear. But as it turned out, I would not need any of those speeches. Sandra was already there in a booth when I walked inside. She was holding an old white ceramic coffee cup. The diner's logo almost faded away. Her eyes were swollen and red, not from a recent cry, but from the deep, persistent redness that comes from weeks of weeping. She looked smaller than I recalled, more fragile and older, carrying a fatigue that went deeper than just being tired. It was the profound weariness of holding on to a false narrative for years, only to finally release it. She broke the silence first. She skipped all the questions I had prepared for, about my job, about McIvan's, the salute, or the phone call. Instead, her words hit me directly. "For 13 years, she said, I called you a failure to anyone who would listen, and you never once corrected me." I could only stare at her. This was my mother, the pillar who held our family together during my father's 30 years of service. The woman who taught herself plumbing, home repair, and our finances. The same woman who had aimed that strength at me like a blade. "I had no choice," was my quiet reply. Her eyelids slowly closed and remained shut for a few seconds. When she opened them, she continued, "Your father tried to show me, not with words. He would just give me this particular look any time I said something about you, as if I was overlooking a crucial piece of the puzzle. He wanted to say something, but he was not able to, and I ignored it every single time." I reached across the table, putting my hand over hers. Her skin was cool from the ceramic mug. We sat quietly for a minute. The waitress, June, came by with more coffee, read the mood with 30 years of experience, and simply moved on. At last, Sandra asked, "Is there anything you can share with me?" So I told her everything I could. I told her I was a lieutenant commander, an officer in the Navy. I let her know I had been serving without a break since I was 18 years old, that I had never washed out or given up. I explained that my duties were classified, which is why I could never give her any specifics. I stressed that missing family events and important calls was never something I did lightly. Each time I was gone, there was a reason I was not permitted to share. She absorbed it all, her head nodding slowly. Then she asked the one question that was most important. "Are you safe?" I paused for a moment, my mind filled with images of command centers, computer screens glowing at 3 in the morning, and operations in hostile territory. "Most of the time," I answered. Sandra gave a short, sudden laugh. It was the kind that bursts out unexpectedly, a blend of relief and sorrow. It was the same laugh my father had. We both noticed it, but left it unsaid. She did not need every single detail. She just needed enough truth to replace the false version of me she had lived with for so long. And for the first time in 13 years, I was allowed to give it to her. We walked out of the diner, side by side. In the lot, the Virginia Beach sun was glaring, bouncing off the cars. As we stood by my vehicle, Sandra did something I had not seen her do since I was a kid. She looped her arm through mine. It was not an embrace, but a more comfortable and casual gesture, like something she did all the time. She kept it there for a moment before heading to her own car. I got into my driver's seat and watched her pull away. The air carried the scent of dust, sea salt, and diner coffee. A sensation I had not felt for years came over me. It was not forgiveness, and it was not relief. It was a quieter feeling, like a brand new chapter was beginning. 6 months after that day, our relationship was different. It was not repaired, but it had shifted. Sandra and I started having weekly phone calls. At first, our conversations were brief, mostly about the weather or her dinner plans, but they gradually grew longer. She would inquire about my place, what I was eating, and other little things in my daily life. She never pried about my work, a kindness that meant more to me than she knew. Tyler even came to say he was sorry face to face. He made the trip from Richmond one weekend and caught me at Sandra's house. He met my gaze directly and said, "I have been a horrible brother. I am not sure how to make it right, but I want to start trying." I told him that was all I needed. Then he hugged me for the first time in more than 5 years. The hug was clumsy and a little too firm, and it went on for just a bit too long, but it felt absolutely right. That year, Thanksgiving 2025, was the first holiday in 3 years where my job was not the family punchline. When one of our cousins asked what I did, Tyler jumped in. "She is not allowed to discuss it," he said. His tone was straightforward, with no hint of a joke or a sneer. It was filled with a genuine respect I had never gotten from him before. And Sandra, when she introduced me to a neighbor, just said, "This is my daughter Elise. She is in the Navy." There were no added excuses or disclaimers, only a statement of simple pride. It took 13 years for me to hear those words. In January, I received a new assignment abroad. This was a pivotal moment in my career, a 2-year deployment leading operations in an undisclosed location. The mission would be tougher than any I had faced, but I was prepared for it. I called Sandra to tell her the news, and she was quiet for a full 15 seconds on the other end. I could just hear her breathing. Then, in a soft voice, she said, "Come home when you are able. I will leave the light on." My throat felt tight, and my grip on the phone hardened. Those were the exact words our father, Oliver, always said. Before every one of his deployments, he would stand with Sandra in the driveway and say, "I will be home when I am able. Leave the light on." She had never once said that phrase to me in 13 years. It was always reserved for him. But now, she was passing his promise on to me, in her own voice. "I will, Mom," I answered, and I knew it was true. The evening before I was scheduled to leave, I decided to open the note that came with my father's belongings. The Navy had sent a box in January with his trident pin, a folded flag, and a single sheet of paper bearing his unmistakable block letters. In the 7 months I had been mourning, I had moved that box 2 times. I had even opened it on 3 different occasions, but only to glance at the contents, never reading the letter. I just had not been able to face it. But tonight was different. I sat on the bed of my empty apartment, my bags ready and my alarm set for 0400. I carefully unfolded the paper. It was torn from a yellow legal pad, his handwriting unsteady from his final medications. He had dated it December 27th, 2024, just 3 weeks before he died. The note started with, "Elise, I never explained the truth to your mother. That failure is mine, not yours. I should have stood up for you. I should have been your defender whenever she made one of her remarks. But I failed to, and for that, I am so sorry. You are my greatest legacy, Elise. Not Tyler, not my service, but you. I love you, kid. Dad." I read his words a first time, and then a second, before clutching the letter to my heart and shutting my eyes. I stayed like that right up until my alarm went off. I am fairly certain I did not sleep. I put the folded note in my uniform, closed my luggage, and switched off the lamp. In the pre-dawn dark, I drove to the airfield. That was 1 year ago. Today, I am stationed overseas, completely immersed in the job I was born to do. The rhythm of the work is demanding, filled with 16-hour days and meetings that start before the sun is up. The choices I make have ramifications I can never share. And I am very good at it. Here, my team knows me by my accomplishments and my title. They use my name with respect. I do not have to hide behind a false story or pretend to be less than I am. At my job, I can finally be my true self. Every Sunday, Sandra and I have a video chat. She wants to know what the weather is like and whether I am getting enough rest. She avoids any talk of my job. Instead, she updates me on her garden. She decided to plant tomatoes this year, something she has not done since my father passed away. She tells me about my niece's softball team and the people who just moved in next door. These are the simple, everyday updates she once reserved for Tyler, assuming I was not interested, but I always was. Sandra also began volunteering at the Fleet and Family Support Center. She now supports other Navy spouses as they navigate deployments and the isolation that often accompanies them. She described comforting a crying 23-year-old woman whose husband had just left for his first tour. Sandra took the young wife's hand and told her, "Be proud of them, most of all when you cannot understand what they do." Now, she wears a recent picture of me on her volunteer ID badge. In the photo, I am in front of a building she will never identify, in the uniform she now views with respect. Tyler also sends me letters written by hand. He fills them with details about his life, like how his daughter Lily is doing as a shortstop. He mentions a new building project going up in Chesterfield County. His letters do not contain apologies anymore. We have moved past that. My brother finally includes me, making me feel like a real sister. His latest letter ended with a powerful note. He wrote, "I told Lily about you. I explained how her aunt serves our country in secret, essential ways. She asked if you were a superhero. I said yes." Reading that alone in my room at 10 on a Wednesday night made me laugh. My eyes stung a little. It was probably the nicest thing he has ever said to me. After my shift tonight, I stepped into the warm, heavy air that seems to stick to your skin. The sky above is perfectly clear, and the stars seem to hang lower and shine brighter than they ever did at home. My fingers found the folded letter I keep in my pocket. It goes everywhere with me. I have it committed to memory now, every shaky word and crossed-out mistake, imagining every hesitation as my father wrote it. You are the best of me. I think back to that day in the chapel often. I can still feel McEwen's hand on my arm, so confident and condescending, the touch of a man sure of his power. I recall my mom's quietness, Tyler's shoes, and the phone call that changed everything. In just 2 seconds, I watched all the color drain from McEwen's face. He snapped to attention with a sharp salute, the kind given by a man realizing the woman he just grabbed outranks most people he ever led. Then, one by one, the whole room started to stand. It began in pockets, and then spread, officer after officer rising until the entire chapel was on its feet. My mother gazed around in disbelief, her reality completely upended. My mind also drifts to Sandra at the diner, her hands cold on her coffee cup when she confessed, "I told people you did not make it." She said it with no apology, like she was convincing herself it was true. I also recall Tyler's simple text, "I am sorry," and how I wrote back, "I know." The shortest words can sometimes carry the most weight. I remember one Thanksgiving when Sandra simply stated, "She is in the Navy." Tyler quickly followed with, "And she cannot talk about it." For once, there were no jokes. The quiet was not filled with made-up stories. I also picture my dad in his garage, among all the scattered parts of an engine. He warned me once, "The Navy will take every single thing you have to give." He could not have been more correct. The price was immense. I lost holidays, family meals, my good name, my mother's respect, and my brother's affection. For 13 years, I was the family failure, sitting at the table where I was supposed to belong. It demanded every ounce of my will, and then some, but it also gave me something in return. It gave me a mission. It provided me with a job that mattered. It put me in a circle of peers who honored my position and my achievements. It gave me the certainty that my silent, secret work, which my family could never grasp, saves lives. Actual people go home to their loved ones because my team made a critical decision at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. My dad spent 30 years defending people he would never meet. I followed that path for 13 years. The work was never the most difficult challenge. The hardest thing was seeing my family truly think I had failed. It was enduring their jokes and their pity at the dinner table, knowing I was bound to silence. That was the single assignment I was never trained for. It felt like a tour of duty with no return date, and it almost shattered me. Things are better now. They have some idea of what I do. They do not have the whole story, naturally. They have no clue about the missions, the objectives, the secret terms, or the awful images from screens that are burned into my memory. But they know what matters. My mom knows I serve. My brother knows my work is significant. And my dad, well, he knew all along. My hand rests on the letter. The paper has grown soft, smoothed by all the nights I have clutched it when the work was overwhelming and home felt a million miles away. You are the best of me. Only 5 words, penned in a shaky script just 3 weeks before my father died. Those 5 simple words said everything that 13 years of being misunderstood had hidden. I draw in a long breath. The night is warm, the stars hang close, and halfway around the world, I know my mom has left the porch light on. For the first time in a long time, it feels like things are finally right. If any of this sounds familiar, if you have ever been the one in your family who is misjudged or unseen, please hold on to this. The ones who really count will always see your true worth. You do not have to carry the weight of anyone else's judgment. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe. I will see you all in the next video.